Thanks for that, Rachel. So that was just a really good overview of study location and venue. So now we're going to have a look how off-venue activity ties it all in together. Apologies if I teach those to suck eggs just slightly at the start. I'm just going to go back and have a look at legacy to put it into context what we currently collect as opposed to what we are planning to collect in data futures, because I'll be saying, oh, this exists here, or this doesn't exist, this is new. We're going to have a look at what we've got now and what are the main principles. We're going to have a very quick look at the consultation exercise that we ran on off-venue activity, notably the removal of statutory clinical placements from the record, and just have a little bit about the context and why we came to that decision. We're going to go through some of the key fields, and like we had with the venue, we're going to have some examples to put some context into some of the main principles. So in student, we currently have the mobility entity, which records all the details of students who decide to go and do work, study abroad. We currently don't have this in the student alternative record, so this would be a new requirement for our previous APs. So by definition, so this is definition of mobility. A mobility experience as part of their course outside the UK refers to any overseas experience organised or endorsed by the provider that takes place during the student's higher education. So this might be, for example, an extended field trip, it could be an Erasmus Plus scheme, it could be some volunteer work abroad. So that's what we currently collect. And the key thing to recognise here is this is where the experience of the course is outside of the UK as opposed to inside the UK. So this is going to be a slight difference to what we're proposing to collect for data futures. Just a key statistic there, when I pulled the slide together back in 15-16 on a mobility presentation I did back then, so there were 40,635 mobility instances recorded in the 15-16 academic year. So this is what we currently have. This is the current model. So the main thing to point out here, and I don't know if my mouse shows anything, but I'm pointing at the instance entity. So a mobility entity can exist for multiple occurrences within an instance. So if the student decides to do three placements throughout the year, then one instance will be joined up with three mobility entities. Yeah, three mobility entities. The fields we currently collect are mobility duration, location, scheme, and type. So duration does what it says on the tin. So it records the expected length in weeks of the mobility experience. The minimum mobility unit of measurement is 1 week. So our system does not allow for decimals, and it can only be returned in weeks. So if you had a 2-month mobility experience, you couldn't say it's recorded in 2 months. It has to be 8 weeks, for example, so we don't get that level of granularity that we're proposing to get in data futures. And where a mobility spans over the HESA reporting year, it should be split. So let's say the student started in May HESA reporting year 1, and they finished their mobility in November. The activity would actually be split between both HESA reportings. The location, I'm not going to go through these. These are just for extra context of some interesting nuances within the mobility location entity, but this records the country that the student has gone to outside the UK. Mobility scheme, so it records the type of mobility scheme that the student is on. So we've got 4 valid entries here. So you've got a provider-led, so anything that's organised or endorsed as part of a provider's course. So placements, field work, etc. We got a sandwich placement, which meets the criteria set out by funding councils, not including Erasmus Plus. We've got Erasmus Plus, and you've also got other schemes. So the main ones are JYA schemes, plus any remainders. The bin is there to symbolise sort of any other code, any other potential schemes which don't fit into the above categories would all be piled into there. And then we've got the type of mobility. So it can be returned multiple times. For example, a student might complete a mobility experience which covers more than one type of activity. So you've got study abroad, so that's like Erasmus field trips. You've got work abroad, I'm going to explain that one, and you've got volunteering as well. So let's say, for example, a student goes to Germany and they decide to do both study and a work placement. So what you could do is you can record both study and also work within there. So what have we got now? So what we have now is the off-venue activity entity. So let's see how this fits in together. So much the same as study location. So it sits as a sub-entity within student course session. And the line there stipulates what we currently have in legacy, that it can be returned multiple times for multiple occurrences of activities that a student might do throughout a student course session. Just going back to the point earlier, a student course session reflects a student's academic engagement on a year of a course. So it can only be, it's 12 months maximum it can be, but it can be shorter depending on the time frames the student actually studies. What's also interesting here as well, oh sorry, let me just, before I skip on and get excited. So off-venue activity, so the definition, a structured activity that an individual student undertakes in connection with their course. So that's quite key as well, has to be part of the course that they're actually on, but away from the provider's venue. Purpose of this is to monitor placements, international mobility and related student activity. So organisations such as Universities UK International, incredibly focused on this type of data that comes from HESA. So the bit that I was going to get excited about was the optional relationship to module instance. So what a provider can do optionally is when they return an off-venue activity, they can also link that to one of the modules they return. So what we could have is interesting information about where a student's gone on a particular module. So that type of data we've never had before, because we took the assumption, well, not the assumption, but within the current legacy collection, you return a block of study retrospectively for a whole year. You've got mobilities within there, but you don't know sort of when it happened or what modules they relate to. So that could be quite interesting to have a look at, if you're a bit nerdy like me anyway. So the main principles of off-venue activity, it both applies to the abroad and the UK as well. So if you remember before with mobility, it only applied to activities that happened outside of the UK. This focuses on any activities that happen both within the UK and outside as well. So we're getting a lot more data here. It's mandatory to be returned where a student has undertaken a placement or a study abroad activity of 20 days or more. Sorry, ignore this, the abroad bit. It's study or placement of 20 days or more. I'm going to touch on what that 20 days or more actually means a little bit later on. It accounts for activity completed at any location that is not at the provider, unless, for example, the student is undertaking the activity at a provider or a partner's venue. For example, they're studying abroad at a partner. This should be returned in this entity. So you create one entity for each distinct activity. Distance learning is not captured in this entity. Teacher training placements in England must be returned irrespective of duration. So the stipulation that they must complete 20 days or more does not apply for teacher training placements. For providers in Scotland, there is not a requirement to return students on their initial teacher training placements. They can have the option to optionally send it, but it's not mandated, it's not a requirement. Statutory clinical placements, distance learning and writing up statuses are not included. And it's returned in the context of a student course session, which we will explain a little bit more in one of the final examples of this presentation. But essentially what that means is that if an occurrence of a placement happened in reference period 1, and the student course session expands reference periods 1, 2, and 3, then you would need to return that activity in both reference period 1, 2, and 3. So you're building up a picture as you go through the student course session, but we'll go for an example just to add some context to that. So let's go back a bit. So in January 2020, what's that, 6 months ago, we held a workshop for statutory customers, health organisations and providers. And what we did this for, we tried to gain an understanding of what health organisations actually wanted from HESA data. And once we had that, then we wanted to ascertain whether providers could easily return that type of data. So one of the things that we're really interested about is when people go on placements, clinical placements, for example, and they wanted a fair amount of detail, so detail that could be offered within the current requirements that we have for our venue activity. But actually through speaking with the providers and statutory customers alike, we gained quite a high level of understanding of how difficult this would actually be for providers to return. A lot of the time they have separate student systems which capture, you know, the clinical medical placement side of things, and it wouldn't tie up to their system. And actually from health organisations, they could get it by other means anyway. And they were more than happy to pursue that idea. We've still got, you know, a question mark under that because, you know, in the future we're not ruling out the possibility, but for now, clinical statutory placements are not a requirement to record an off-venue activity. So that's just an example of some of the ones that could include a clinical placement. It's not exclusive. There's going to be a load more examples we can imagine coming through to liaison through questions, for example. But these are just the list that we've currently got, and it'd be quite nice to add to this list. So if you've got any other areas which, you know, might have a statutory clinical placement, then, you know, let us know, and we can add those into the guidance as well. But those, you know, those are the big ones. Those are the main ones. So a nice little flow diagram for a provider to use to determine whether they need to return something in off-venue activity. So the first question is asked, is it an initial teacher training placement in England? If it is, you have to include it regardless of duration. If not, you go on to the next one. Is it a statutory clinical placement? If it is, you exclude. If not, you carry on. Is this placement longer than 20 days? If it is, you include it. If it's not, then the question you ask yourselves is, does the combined duration of any placements that's 5 days or more in length add up to 20 days or more in the student course session? We're going to go on to that one a little bit more using examples, but essentially, if you had a very short placement in reference period 1, but then combined with a placement that you took in reference period 2, so they equate to more than 20 days duration, there's a requirement for you to return both placements. Like I said, we've got an example. So I'm just going to do a run through of the fields in our venue activity. So act duration and act duration type. Act duration is used to indicate the duration of the off-venue activity in the units indicated by off-venue activity act duration type. So the duration of the activity should exclude any holidays or any other gaps. So for example, if a student does a work placement for 5 days of the, you know, 5 working days, then the activity would exclude the weekends. So this gives you more granularity. So it's very much like how SP length and unit length works in legacy. So you can record, you know, even down to the number of hours of a placement, if you'd like. But you can also record in days, weeks, which is the equivalent to mobility, or also months. For providers in England, however, when they're doing a teacher training placement, it must be reported in days. Act start and act end dates. This records the start and end date of an activity, and this doesn't take into account the, it does take into account any gaps in learning or weekends, for example. So combined with act duration, they won't necessarily add up, but this just includes the start and end date of the activity. Act type ID. So the type of activity, so we've got 4 codes that can be returned here. So you've got teacher training placements, you've got unpaid work, paid work, and study placements. So you can see quite a key difference here is that we both split the work placements to have unpaid and paid as well, which would be quite interesting, because I think one of the difficulties before is that when you had volunteering, you could be volunteering, but you could still be being paid, or you could be an unpaid volunteer. So I think this makes it much more clear as to what category an activity should go in. So there's just some quick definitions of the different valid entries. I won't go through them, they're fairly self-explanatory, but they're just there for reference. And then we've got host ID type and host ID. So this records the identifier of the host where the off-venue activity is taking place. So up until quite recently, it covered all placements, but however, work placements are excluded from the coverage. There wasn't a requirement to break that down even further. So we removed some of the codes there. So company's house number and NHS ID have been removed. So we've got 3 codes here. So you've got a UK PRN, so that could identify if the student studies at a partner, a different organisation that a provider might be collaborating with. You've got URNs, which can be used for the teacher training placements, and you've got a HISA identifier, which can be used. And if a provider returns an 05 in the host ID type, then it opens up a number of different possibilities to return in host ID. So this is where you can really break down even further what a student is doing if they weren't at a partner UK provider with UK PRN, or if they weren't at a school on placement. So other slightly less interesting fields in the entity, which we won't go into. So we've got MOBSCHEME currently. That exists. That's got the exact same framework. You've got country, which is country. You've got MODINST ID, which I got particularly excited about earlier, which allows an optional link to a module instance. So we're going to go through some worked examples now. So example 1, student A goes, aptly named, student A goes on 2 work placements in the first reference period. They go to France for 11 days and they go to Germany for 11 days. So if in reference period 1, you would return both placements because the total add up to 20 days or more in the duration, as explained there. So example 2, assuming that the world has gone back to normal with all these, student B does a 2-week work placement in Italy in reference period 1. At that point, the provider does not know whether they will do 20 days total activity across the student course session, so they choose not to return them in reference period 1. Sorry, something key I should have said earlier, if a placement's under 20 days, by all means the provider can return them, as they do in the mobility entity currently, but there's not a requirement to do so. Student B then does a 2-week work placement in China in reference period 3. As they've now breached the threshold of the 20 days, the provider would need to return both placements in reference period 3. So 1 and 2, nothing returned because the provider assumes the student won't be doing any more than 20 days. But in reference period 3, they return both the off-venue activity they did in that reference period when they went to China around due time, actually this time, and they would also backdate a further entity to record when they went to Italy to do some paid work as well. Example 3, student C does a 12-day work placement in Belgium in reference period 1. The provider at that point does not know whether they will do more than 20 days, so again chooses not to return them. They then do a 5-day work placement in reference period 2. The provider again at that point doesn't know whether they're going to do the 20 days, so chooses not to return them. And then the student then doesn't do a placement in reference period 3. The provider doesn't have a requirement to send any off-venue activity data because the 20-day threshold has not been breached. So example 4, so a student starts their placement partway through reference period 1, and at the point of returning reference period 1 data to HISA, the student's still on their placement. The student then finishes their placement in reference period 2. So in reference period 1, the provider would return the placement activity start date and then provide an estimate for the end date with an estimated duration calculated based on the difference, again excluding any anticipated days not worked, weekends, holidays, etc. For the most part, a provider will roughly know when a student will go on placement and when they will eventually return from placement. But again, this is an estimate because a provider won't know for sure because it's happening in the future when a student might come back. So in reference period 2, when that student eventually does come back, you can then return that placement again, use the same start date, but if you need to make any corrections to the end date and duration, a provider would do so there. So example 5, so the provider returns the student as having completed an off-venue activity in reference period 1. After the data was then signed off, the provider realizes that the student never started or even completed that activity. Sorry, completed or even started that activity. So this is what they return, and this indicates, sorry, this highlights the fact that off-venue activities are returned against a student course session. So you can see in reference period 1, they returned that off-venue activity. Then in reference period 2, the provider realized that they make a mistake, so omits OVA ID 1 from their return, but they actually did another placement. So they've popped that in there. Then for reference period 3, you've got that legacy one that they actually did in RP2, which is OVA ID 2, and they also did a further placement as well. So you can see we're building up a picture as we go through the student course session. So right at the end of the student course session, when all said and done, you have a complete picture of any off-venue activities that they went on. It was also one of the key decision makers for not submitting against a reference period, because we'd have to add in, a new field to highlight when something should have never come through. So we'd have to remove from the role that view the data. But this is a much more clean approach. And that's my bit done. Has anyone got any questions of, the content that I've just went through?
It seems that we have no further questions, Charlie. Rachel, do you have anything else to add?
No, nothing for me.
No. From off the top of my head, it's PGR next week. Am I correct?
It is final session, PGR students.
Excellent. So final session, session 7, PGR next week. As I say, we'll get this video uploaded as soon as we can. Otherwise, have a super afternoon, and we will speak to you again next week. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.